So today's collections training is going to be on two aircraft, the 1903 Wright Flyer replica and the 1913 Deperdussin. So the Wright Flyer was built by Wilbur and Orville Wright. They sort of got their beginning in sort of the vehicle industry through bicycles in the late 1800s. Their interest expanded into vehicles in flight following the research of German aviator Otto Lilienthal. When Lilienthal died in a glider crash, they decided to start experimenting with their own flying vehicles. In 1903, the Wrights achieved one of the first flights through adding a rudder, and Wilbur flew this plane for 59 seconds over a distance of 852 feet. At first, the Wright brothers did not find success in the U.S. in their starting their aviation business. A lot of people didn't believe in the claims that they were able to fly their vehicles. However, Europe was much more enthusiastic, and so they started their business there, and that's where the aviation industry initially took off. In 1906, the Wrights received received a U.S. patent for their method of flight control, and in 1909, they sold this patent to the newly formed Wright Company. The Wright Company then engaged in patent wars by suing foreign and domestic aviators and companies for inventing their own aircraft, specifically for their aircraft control systems of flight. Some of their biggest lawsuits were against this other U.S. aviation pioneer, Glenn Curtiss, who they sued 9 times, and they ended up winning all 9 of those lawsuits. The patent wars continued to rage on beyond the Wright Company after Orville's retirement and Wilbur's death, as other manufacturers launched lawsuits of their own, and this sort of grew into a very large crisis in the U.S.'s aviation industry. The patent wars stalled development, and in contrast, Europe, that didn't have this issue, evolved and innovated their aircraft much more quickly. Toward the end of 1917, the U.S. government intervened as a result of World War I to put an end to this patent industry, so the patent wars would no longer stall the U.S.'s aviation industry. So, the stagnation of the U.S.'s industry due to the patent wars significantly damaged the Wright brothers' reputation, and the opinion of them remained sort of negative to lukewarm until World War II, when U.S.'s wartime advertising rehabilitated the Wrights as patriots and pioneers of aviation. So our specific Wright reproduction was built in completion by staff and volunteers here at Owl's Head on April 1st, 1997. So moving on to the Deperdussin. The creator of the Deperdussin airplane was a man named Armand Deperdussin. He got involved in aviation in 1910 after being inspired by Louis Blériot. Deperdussin founded his aviation manufacturing company, the Société de Production des Aéroplanes Deperdussin. In 1912, he purchased his own airfield and built 30 aircraft workshops, along with one of the first formal flying schools. The Deperdussin won the Gordon Bennett Trophy in 1912 to one of his aircraft being the first to fly over 100 miles per hour, and he broke that record again in 1913 at 124.8 miles per hour. Deperdussin was more of a businessman than a pilot, and he lacked the technical knowledge of building and innovating airplanes himself. The creation and design of his aircraft was the work of Louis Blériot, the chief aviation mechanic and engineer hired for his company. Deperdussin's company went bankrupt in 1913, and it was renamed the Société pour l'Aviation et ses Dérivés, also known as SPAD. Sorry if I butchered that. And this renaming happened when it was taken over by Blériot's Aéronautique in 1914 by Louis Blériot, the man that inspired Deperdussin to get into the aviation industry in the first place. Louis Blériot was kept on as the chief aviation engineer and helped Blériot design SPAD aircrafts going forward. So for specific history about this Deperdussin, this was loaned to us by Thomas Watson Jr. on April 14th of 1992. On September 22nd, 1993, Watson transformed this Deperdussin loan into a donation, and it's remained here ever since. Hasn't always hung from the ceiling. It was flown at some point, but this is where it lives now. All right.
Thank you.
So I always say, where do I start? But this is where we start right here. So this is the Wright Flyer, and without this airplane and that bends around the corner, I don't think we would have a museum, because this was the beginning of this whole dream of flight. And the Wright brothers unlocked that secret, because no one could really figure out how to fly with powered means. So, you know, back then it was the dream since day one to fly. But now it's now the excuse is we don't have time or money to fly. So it's out there with us. So the Wrights were geniuses. They were bicycle mechanics, and they wanted to figure out how to fly these airplanes. And they were so scientific about their methods. They actually built wind tunnels and proved scientific tables wrong at the time. There was tables out there they were using that weren't jiving. So they totally changed it up and designed this airplane. Their engine was a wonder too. They had went to different manufacturers to try to get this engine to so many horsepower under a certain weight. Couldn't be done, but they did it. They designed it and built it, and their propellers were so efficient we barely can beat that today, the efficiency of that. But the biggest thing is, there was a lot of people that actually flew before the Wrights, but the Wrights had full control of their airplane. They were big on control. So they developed this wing warping, this whole set of wings twists to control roll. And that was something that no one could figure out how to do. They added a rudder, but the rudder wasn't used for turning. They figured turning was a change of lift in the direction of lift. So the rudder helped the adverse yaw, they call it, of the down wing with so much drag. It was an ingenious thing. It was built in. It was a feature that's used in a lot of modern airplanes. They actually hook the rudder into the ailerons or wing warping to control the airplane. So this first flight was basically from here down to around the C4, just past the C4. The first flight, 120 feet, 12 seconds. So the last flight, 4 flights that day, 852 feet, 59 seconds. So it was an actual controllable airplane. They were flying in 27-mile-an-hour winds still. It was pretty nuts. We won't drag anything out of the hangar with that kind of wind. But they had full control. That was their big thing. So yeah, it was built here by volunteers. It never flew. I'd love to try to fly it, but it's very. They had built replicas and tried to fly them. They were extremely tricky, very sensitive. You know, it was the first thing. Two propeller design. So they actually had a single engine and crossed. If you notice, one chain is crossed. So propellers would turn, they would turn not the same direction, which would cause problems. They went the opposite way. They had figured all of these things out. Extremely light, built with wood, covered with muslin. But it was on a track. They didn't have wheels, so it was on the sands of Kitty Hawk. They would have this track, set it into the wind, and roll it along the track. They used catapults later when they went back to Ohio. They were from Ohio. There was no wind, it was hot, and they actually had to have a catapult arrangement to get it to build up speed enough to fly. So we talked about the Deperdussin. This thing was built 10 years. There's 10 years between these two airplanes. That thing was doing 126 miles an hour in 1913. And a lot of people ask, wow, you know, the war was coming up. Why wouldn't that be a great warplane? Well, in World War I, the reason for an airplane was observation. It was to map things. And that was not, you know, dogfighting, all that stuff wasn't out yet. So going fast and small and one person had no purpose. One really cool thing about the Wright brothers was their dream was to make flying would make war impossible. It was their big dream that wars could be obsolete. How could you go up with something so terrible? You know, if everyone could see what you're doing. So that was a dream of a lot of aeronautics back then, that war would be a thing of the past. So it's another dream. But they went, you know, for a long time doing this. But you got a question.
What are the two front wings?
Two what?
Two front wings.
Two front wings. That's an elevator. So there's 3 controls. You have rudder in the back,
You have warp for roll control, and there was the front elevator. That would pivot this way and nose up and down. It's called a canard, which means tail first. So they were big on keeping the elevator up front, which is, it's a very efficient thing. The airplane doesn't want to stall that way. There's a lot of modern home-built designs built like that. But this, they later on lengthened the arm because it was so sensitive. Holy cow, it was almost uncontrollable. It was so sensitive. But they used that for many years until probably 1910 when they decided to put the elevator in the back, extend that line.
Is the motor actually working on
It is not. It's built from wood and stuff. So well, they have built a replica of one, 12 horsepower. It's 12 horsepower, and I forget the weight. It's like 250 pounds. I'm wrong, I'm not sure. But they have built one of these, and actually they tried to fly the replica on the 100th anniversary. They tried to fly it that day. The conditions were right. It never flew, but it's a pretty amazing, for what it was. I mean, honestly, no one was flying. So, and then it wasn't many years, they were way ahead of the Europeans and all that stuff. When they went to Europe to demonstrate the airplane in 1908, it blew everything away in Europe. The Europeans thought they were big, but when the Wrights came over and were doing figure eights and altitude and speed, they were geniuses. Very tight family. They had a sister. She was one of the first in history to fly in an airplane. Kathy. Pretty cool. So, yeah.
Tell us about the thing in the back that looks like a kite, the big box kite.
So that's the rudder. That's your vertical control. Like on a boat, the rudder, on a boat, it turns you. But it's kind of complicated. And flying, the rudder doesn't turn you. Say you turn that rudder flat, you'll just go sideways. So to turn an airplane, you have to change the lift. If you bank to the left, you're changing the lift that way. Now the rudder counteracts the drag of the down wing of the down airline. Just wants to drag down instead of pull up. So the rudder, they figured this out. Gliders, they were doing gliders just like this. The first gliders were just like this glider. So they figured out what that rudder took care of. So pretty good. Oh yeah, oh yeah. Well, there's two vertical. If you look at the front, you just see two planes like this. So just like the elevators, how the wind hits it, but dual rudder gives you a little more action. So it's right behind the propeller. So there's some power of wind that control that.
So why did you go from that two-piece muslin, very lightweight rudder to this kind of thing?
Well, half of the speed. So this was flying at 25 miles an hour. So that airplane's 125. So the faster you go, the less control surface you do. This actually, when it was original, it was built with wing warping. This was built for a movie back in the 70s. So it's got modern engines, it's got modern wings. So they have ailerons on the wing. But the original had wing warping, and the wing warping would work much better the faster you go. I know I flew a lot of wing warping airplanes, and they're just absolutely horrible at slow speeds. They almost don't work. So you need speed. So that was a very fast airplane. You didn't need big surfaces. And to go fast, you have to make things smaller, to make that thing go 125.
Two things. You mentioned that the engine is a dummy, but I've come to understand, or back in the day when they were building the thing, that all the other controls are operational. The engine is the only thing that's a dummy on that airplane. So if you put a running engine in there, you can try to fly. Might not succeed, but you can try. What was the other thing?
They had drawings from the Smithsonian, I believe, when they built it.
Yeah, they had the plans from the Smithsonian.
Yeah, so it's all built. It could fly if it had the right engine.
If it had the right engine.
Yes.
Right. The other thing I was thinking is, that the pilot lays down.
Yeah.
And that these guys might be interested to know in how do you make these controls work, and you don't even control the rudder per se.
Right. So yeah, it's in a prone position. I suppose part of it, it's a natural thing to lay down like a bird. It's also drag. The more you sit up, the more drag you have. But there is a hip control, right, where his hips are, and that you would slide your hips side to side to warp the wing. So it's a natural thing to want to lean over and get that wing down. One hand, this left hand on the stick, and that was the elevator. So that was one hand on the elevator, and I believe that thing, when you tripped the wire at full advance, and you would be at full power, and you couldn't control the speed of the engine. Which they didn't have much control of engines back then anyway. But the rudder, yes, the rudder is connected through wires to the wing warp. So when that cradle was you slid that cradle over and the wings twisted, the rudder went over to counteract that. So that was automatic. Again, that's a cool thing that's still used today. This whole interconnected rudder, because the rudder, if you get into flying, the rudder is what can kill you. Over or misuse of the rudder makes the airplane stall, spin, spin anyway. So controlling that automatically was a great thing. But laying down, they did that, I almost think 1905 they changed that. They went to upright. They started sitting up side by side. And they went to wheels probably about 1910. So they didn't have to set this whole track arrangement up. Like I said, when they went to Ohio and there was no wind and it was hot, they actually had to have a big catapult. They had a big tower with a weight, and it would pull them to get them in the air. It was the only way to get them flying. Once they're flying, they're flying.
This was a real question. The wings droop,
Yeah.
okay, and which is dehedral. You have positive dehedral, you have negative dehedral.
Anhedral, yeah. Called anhedral.
Okay, so, but after this, you don't see airplanes with wings that droop too much.
Well,
Why did the Wrights, of what purpose is the droop, which is engineered right into the airplane? They're not drooping because it's hanging from the ceiling.
well, it's if you notice, it needs to be rigged a little better because it's not supposed to have that much anhedral.
Okay.
But the deal is, when it lifts, it'll go up to flat.
Okay.
So it's not built in, it's just the weight of everything.
Okay.
Anhedral, dihedral definitely wasn't in the picture at all. And dihedral is when you see an airplane with a V in the wings, they're up like this. Well, there's reasons for that. There's less lift, but it's more stable. The more dihedral an airplane has, the more stable it is. It doesn't want to turn, it wants to return to a natural, neutral flying status. Any model, you get glider and stuff, they all have a V in the wings. So this stuff, but it's mostly the weight. So it's not really built in with an anhedral, that's what it's called. It'll go kind of flat when it's flying.
Okay.
What do you think? We've never seen fly.
Let's
Our
fly.
pictures, yeah. It is.
The wooden fuselage,
Yeah.
what's that all about?
Well,
What does it look like?
Yeah, that is called a monocoque structure. So that's strips of wood wrapped around a mold and glued together. It's very ahead of its time. It's almost the same as a stressed skin airplane of today. If you look at a Cessna, it's just got aluminum, very little structure inside. It's just like aluminum stringers in there, and it's all riveted. So it's its own strength. So they were way ahead. Deperdussin, there it is. There's your whole strength, strong and light. Everyone tried things back then. They were ahead of the game with that. But you think about this, 10 years. And then we used to have the space capsule. It's in storage now. There was a Mercury space capsule here. But if you think about it, it's pretty amazing to think from 1903 to 1969, 66 years, we were going 120 feet and then we're walking on the moon. 66 years, one generation saw back then. Horse and buggy to being on the moon was insane. It's a lot of change in one short period. So the history of aviation is in 100 years, holy cow. Things have stayed the same for thousands of years, but in 100 years, we went from this to, supersonic flight. Pretty nice.